Oh, Luke, I like the new digs.
Gonna do a bit. Hold on. All right, be seated. I want you to remember that no bastard won a trade war by buying stuff from another country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard buy stuff from his country. Man, all this stuff you hear about America not wanting a trade war, wanting to keep the status quo is a lot of nonsense. Americans love to fight. All real Americans love the give and take of trade negotiations. But trade is a messy business. The Chinese are the counterparty. Wade into their markets. Spill their coin, or they will spill yours. This is the current status. It's grim. Chinese goods have crossed our borders and invaded our markets. They're walking around like they own the place. And I'll say, with these trade deficits and capital accounts, they will own it soon enough. But at the behest of our commander-in-chief, we've launched a trade offensive. Over 100% tariffs we threw at them, but they're striking back. Now, how much coin and political capital will he throw into the front? However much it takes to get the job done.
I mean, to be honest, yeah, it first struck me as Top Gun, but at the same time, I'm not sure I really would have been able to describe what Patton looks like.
Well, it's not like this. Okay, I realize that. I realized as soon as I saw myself, sort of in the video, I don't have the helmet. Yeah, you need the helmet. I need like the gloves, and he's got like a stick, and I obviously need, the generals. Yeah, it was a mess.
Well, no, you got the demeanor down just right.
I mean, I was curious about how the trade war might turn out. So I thought about it a little bit and I came to a conclusion. And I looked at Trump's goals and his obstacles. I looked at the Chinese leverage. I looked at American leverage. And quite frankly, to get to the final point, I don't think much is going to change. Just to walk around the map here, we got the IMF, maybe international coalition sitting on the side, China over here. This is what I'm calling the free trade ideal. And then this white line is the current battle lines, if you will. You'll see that China's over the line a little bit. And then inside, I sort of built my understanding of what these are going to be the structural components, what I view of the Chinese system. These are the tariffs and maybe some of the other things that were listed in that trade representative document. Perhaps there are some things that could be on the table. I'm thinking these are not on the table. They are structural. And then these walls essentially are going to be a couple things that are pretty formidable but standing in the way. And what I wrote here, I got the bond market, the election, and just intelligence in general. And you can see down here, there are some ways in which America has also encroached upon the free trade ideal and has crossed over, but I don't think it's nearly to the extent, in my personal opinion. So we're going to walk through this. I'm going to double click into some of these into some more detail, and maybe I'll convince you as to my thoughts. But first, some of my Bonafides. I'm going to list my Bonafides in the description sort of in more detail, but I'll just say that I worked as a market analyst when I lived in China, total for about 5 years. I speak Chinese, although not nearly as well as I did 10 years ago. I've given speeches in Chinese. 有可能，很有可能可以说几句话. So yeah, I mean, let's look. The first place here, I'm going to take these glasses off. The first place I wanted to start, and I think something I could add to the conversation, has to do with the Chinese psyche. I don't think this is really appreciated here, but it's really defined, in my view, really by the century of humiliation, the 百年屈辱. So the fundamental contract, in my view, between the people and the government is to promise that the 100 years of humiliation will never happen again. And if you remember, 1840, that's the beginning of the first Opium War. So that's when the British forced the Chinese markets open so that British can sell them opium. I think this, coming from this place, so to speak, it sort of makes you naturally antagonistic and suspect to foreigners. And China, arguably, throughout its entire history, has never really been outward looking. It's sort of always been inward looking. Now, in order to ensure that the century of humiliation does not happen again, it's promised essentially military strength. But they recognize that to achieve military strength, first you need economic strength. And then on top of that, what makes this worse, and this is sort of a slightly more nuanced point that if you might not be aware of unless you've like lived in China and sort of read the news of China and really try to understand the Chinese perspective, it's that the Chinese news portrays America whenever it can as trying to hold back the inevitable. And the inevitable is the rise of China. So the tariffs, when something like tariffs happen, it's very natural for them to do two things. One is to confront it, right? Any act of foreign aggression, such as a declaration of 100% tariffs or a trade war, it must be fought. For if it is not fought, then it almost suggests a breaking of that promise to, never have the century of humiliation happen again. The other thing that happens is it very, very neatly falls into a very well-worn narrative that America is trying to hold back China. It just falls in there so easily. And that's how it's portrayed. Here in America, we see it as, okay, we want to try to balance the trade deficit because we think we're getting a raw deal. However, how it's portrayed to the public there, it's, okay, they're trying to hold China back. We're getting ahead. They're worried. They're scared. That kind of stuff. So I wanted to mention that. The other thing I wanted to hit on are a couple of these points I want to drill down into: the import controls, the currency, and the China Incorporated. For the import controls, something that drives me kind of crazy, certainly when I was there, had to do with what we don't really talk about, but import controls in the sense that they don't let foreign goods enter into the country. And we have to remember, and I don't think it should be understated, the importance of the quote unquote Great Firewall of China. So let's just list off all of the US tech companies or tech companies in general. Most of them, are US that are just not allowed to operate in China. Google, blocked since 2010. Now that's the search, YouTube, and Gmail of Google, as they did not comply with the censorship demands. Although I think Google advertising is still there. And there's still Google Cloud. Facebook since 2009. Instagram since 2014 for the same reason, censorship. Twitter X since 2009. LinkedIn and Yahoo since 2021 due to this was kind of a broader regulatory crackdown and compliance costs. Snapchat, Reddit, Tumblr, Pinterest, Slack, Discord, Dropbox, Netflix, Spotify, Wikipedia, and most news outlets.
Wow, Wikipedia. I didn't even realize.
So local players like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, ByteDance, they dominate the tech space, right? I mean, anytime that there's there's a Chinese version of Google, it's called Baidu. And they can just make the, Renren, that's like Facebook. So, I mean, I consider that to be a huge restriction on free trade, and they are structural. There's no way that the Chinese government would ever allow them in. I don't see, it doesn't matter how high the tariffs you want to get. Okay. That's something that's not changing.
Despite Mark Zuckerberg learning Chinese, still not going to work.
Despite his best efforts to learn Chinese, I don't think there's any concession that could happen. Maybe, they talk about censorship demands. I don't think it was really, they frame it, certainly, a long time ago when I started studying Chinese, they framed it for political reasons, and kind of censorship reasons. But I always kind of thought it was economic. I just kind of want to raise that back into the conversation.
Is this a import control technically?
I'm using that. So like the import control recently, I think it was around some agricultural products that they just wouldn't let in. I'm going to slot it into an import control in the sense it's not a tariff. It's just like you're not allowed in.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, it's a total embargo.
Yeah.
Which is just like taken for the norm, by the way.
Just taken for
like
the norm.
People don't, like in America, we don't really talk about that. I don't know if there's a sense that we don't really care or... I guess I don't know what it is. Like, it's definitely not something in daily American life talking about the absence of American tech companies in China. But it is
Right.
pretty stark because it operates, all of these huge companies like Google, Facebook, they're, the biggest companies in the world. They're just completely absent there.
The other thing I wanted to mention, the currency devaluation. So this is also something that I haven't heard, with all the talk and stuff about tariffs, they don't talk about these so much. Tech they talk about, but the currency devaluation I wanted to remind you about. So this is the exchange rate. And they use a managed exchange rate regime. So as you can see here, in the past, they held it firm. They pegged it to the US dollar. And around 2005, they started to let it float a little bit. And you'll notice that it very quickly became stronger. Now so what are we looking at? This is basically the number of yuan or renminbi that a single dollar could purchase. So if the number goes down, it means the Chinese currency is strengthening. It's getting stronger. You need more dollars to purchase the same amount of yuan or renminbi. And you can see it was going down pretty starkly. And then they kind of hit the brakes around here. And as this number goes down, then the less competitive they become in foreign trade. Okay. So now, since here they've been managing it in a certain range, but where it would fall if all control was off is impossible to know. But that's fine and all. But I also wanted to mention that the Chinese kind of take it a step further, and they say the number that they're targeting, or the range, the regime, is built around their trade surplus or deficit. That's one of the main, that they call it the primary deciding factor on how they decide what the exchange rate should be. And it's not just against the dollar, it's against a basket of currency. So let me show you that. The first place, so this is the People's Republic of China. That's the Central Bank of China. You go to their English web page, and it says, China pursues a managed floating rate exchange rate regime based on market supply and demand with reference to a basket of currencies. It's not really what I just said, is it? This is the Chinese page. They say a little bit more. And, I'm not going to read this and translate it. Google Translate's pretty good. So this is the translation of the Chinese page. And, so this is a little awkward translation. Okay, it doesn't actually say 我国 translate. It's just kind of a polite way of saying China, or like my country. But they translate it a little awkwardly. They say, that's the English part. And then they go into a little more detail down here. It's floating based on market supply and demand. Second, the exchange rate fluctuation range is dramatically adjusted according to the current account, mainly the trade balance, giving play to advantages of quote unquote management. I mean, it's a primary driver. Yeah.
So yeah, that's like a pretty key point.
That's a key point. Okay. This is how it's structured. Their economy is, or certainly at the very least, how they're managing their currency is built around the trade deficit or trade surplus. It is running a trade surplus is fundamental to their fiscal and monetary systems. Okay, they wrote it down. This is not on the discussion table for China, but it's key. It's like super important.
Sorry, what was the third item?
Third, referencing a basket of currencies, that is looking at the exchange rate from perspective of a basket of currencies and not focusing on one side in the bilateral exchange between the RMB and a single currency. So I guess the third is they're looking at a basket, not just, for instance, the US.
It's like the third point's trying to hedge the second point a little bit.
Yeah, and maybe that's kind of why it's bouncing around a lot more here, because it's not just against the US, it's against a whole bunch of currencies.
Well, I mean, but at the same time, there's really one direction in which it's going, with like a couple blips here and there. Like,
which one's that?
Trump's first term and then post-COVID. Yeah, when was that? Yeah. So I think this is probably one of the big reasons why they called it a currency manipulator, because this was right around the start of the trade war. And so, like, I don't know, on a percentage basis there, like, that's probably right around the size of the net effective tariffs that the U.S. imposed on China. So that's like a pretty straightforward way of effectively neutralizing the tariffs altogether. Certainly second half of 2018, that's when it was ramping up. And then I think they said it in like mid to late 2019 or so, like as after all that happened. And then like it bumped a little higher than even. And then just like everything else in the world, though, once COVID hit, like everything, all bets are off. And
Gotcha.
so I'm by no means an expert on Chinese financial markets in any way, but that was like the really big topic for a while there in 2018, 2019, especially looking at the deviation between the onshore and the offshore renminbi on a daily basis, because there were points whenever there were like, statistically extremely large, like it's beyond a shadow of a doubt, there was, thumb on the scale multiple times as that period was going on. But that's another topic. Maybe we can dive more deeply into that another day. And, or, for that matter, keep a closer eye on this exchange rate from today, see where it goes from here.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd watch that. The next one I wanted to talk about, skip over tech. I think that's kind of been talked to death. I don't have too much more to add to that. I want to talk about this China Incorporated that we mentioned. I want to give you a bit of an anecdote that I personally experienced as to what this really means in practice. I'm going to share with you a commercial.
熬夜加班补充维他命，奔波劳累补充维他命，周围有人感冒补充维他命，维他命水随时随地补充维他命，农夫山泉出品。
All right, Joe, what was that a commercial for?
Vitamin water?
Right. No, wrong. If you look closely, it's Victory Vitamin. So that's the Chinese knockoff. Now, the fact that there are Chinese knockoffs is not really my point. We know that. This is, I think, a good case study into how Chinese Incorporated works. So again, I lived in China from 2010 to 2014, and I was there for 2 semesters, one in high school and one in college. And around 2012 or something, when I was living there, this Victory Vitamin started showing up on the shelves. What happened was news segments. I remember watching a news segment. It was the news, okay? It was like the evening news, and they had a segment. And what they were doing was comparing the Victory Vitamin with vitamin water. And they were kind of going around and they were asking people, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? They were comparing the nutrition facts, and they're like, oh, look, one has, more energy. And then I remember thinking, like, energy has more sugar. Okay. But if you listen to it, it's just like a 10-minute long commercial for the domestic brand.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I was going to say. I wonder what people said about it.
Yeah. Okay. No surprise. All right. And like, that's one way. That's kind of one little example of how China Incorporated work. The news is there to promote the domestic brand. Okay.
And you can't do that if Google and Facebook are there telling you how good vitamin water is.
Right. The other thing, there's a legal side. I think Coca-Cola or something, they tried suing Nongfu, which is like the brand, because they wanted to at least change like the shape of the bottle. I mean, the bottle is exactly the same. Okay. Apparently the patent was filed and got through or whatever from the Nongfu before them. So there was just nothing there that they could do. There's nothing there that Coca-Cola could do, right? Legally, it was all buttoned up, but it was like, obviously, I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That's China Incorporated. It kind of is a little extent. Now imagine that across kind of every product all the time. The other thing I wanted sort of to mention along the same line is, quote, shout out to the All In podcast. This week, there was one point being made about how about how US brands aren't looking as good as they used to in China. Like the image of America is bad.
The issue of Ken Griffin, who made some comments this week about the brand that is America, and effectively said there was sort of a sell America situation going on. And my question about the brand that is America is whether you think after these whatever deals get done, that you can put the toothpaste back in the tube. Not going to still be some kind of toothpaste on the rim that you can't stick back. It gets all nasty and crusty, right?
Having lived there, I know that the U.S. image is under attack and under pressure all the time from like official news and media outlets, just all the time. I can tell you another example, which I thought was more galling. And it was, I was there when Neil Armstrong died. And I was really surprised. I remember watching, again, a news segment, and they made mention of it. And I was surprised. I was like shocked that they put this on the news, and they kind of gave a couple spoke for maybe 4 or 5 minutes about his accomplishments. And then do you know what they did? Do you know what they did?
I do not.
Joe, they probably spent 10 minutes detailing all the evidence as to why the moon landing was fake. And like my jaw was on the floor. I mean, I had to like wipe the spittle off my chin and kind of like gather myself. You don't, like, again, until you live there, you don't understand.
Hate us because they ain't us.
Every chance. So, I think most recently Lululemon has been in the news because they're kind of out people. I don't know how this was planted or how this came about. Lululemon in the news because they were publicizing the extremely high markups, like 1,000% markups, and again tarnishing the Lululemon brand. I think it's a Canadian company, but you get it. It's from the Chinese perspective, it's us versus the world.
Now, has this been something that has changed dramatically just recently? Because the Lululemon thing, I actually heard about that. Like all over social media, there's these, I don't know, influencers, Chinese influencers that make their way onto the US ones.
Yeah, they're bought and paid for. Come on.
Yeah. And then, but that's their whole message. Like, oh, hey, look, we make it here. Look at the crazy markup.
Yeah.
Everything else is exactly the same. China is so much better. You guys are just like, it's to me, it's presenting the image like they're trying to say the U.S. is almost like robbing people of all this extra money for no reason. It's like they just say anything else outside of physically making the product in this location is immaterial and means nothing, and therefore should not be marked up.
Yeah. So
buy directly from China instead.
Yep. And this is just it's incessant and pervasive. So like when I heard, the Chinese brand or that the US brand in China isn't as like cool as it used to be, it's obvious. Of course, how could it? The next thing I wanted to just kind of talk about, again, just in the context of this whole trade war, who's going to win, all that kind of stuff, is China's counterattack. Kind of what they did. Now, everyone, and what's covered quite thoroughly are the tariffs, because those are just numbers you can compare against. But I wanted to draw you to a website I found. I thought was very well. I don't think I can do really a much better job. This Holland Knight, I think they're lawyers. It's a good summary of both the timeline, but then more importantly, what I find to be more interesting has to do with the other weapons, so to speak, if we're using the battle metaphor, that are at the Chinese disposal. So we have the tariffs. Don't need to expand upon those. We have the export controls. So we know about the rare earths that were unleashed, and what export controls says is you're not going to let these products out of the country. Right. Now that includes items. So you can look at critical minerals, but it also can include companies. So you can say this company is no longer going to be exporting, say, to the United States. Hey, so quick correction. It's not that the list of companies are actually U.S. companies that China can no longer export to. The idea is the list of products are dual use products that these companies are buying. So dual use means it could be used in the military, and China's shutting it down. So sorry about that. And some of the things that could be included there, I think on the list I looked at were things like drones, certain maybe other key items of supply for like the U.S. military, things like that. The other thing that they have at their disposal is something that's called the unreliable entity list. And in the interpretation, it's basically sanctions, right? So what they're saying, they're putting a list of companies in the U.S. that can no longer like buy or sell things into China. So China, you can't, you're no longer, our markets buying into or buying from are no longer open to you. That's the unreliable entity list. Another thing that the Chinese have done, and they can do more of, enforcement actions. So basically, they hit Google with an antitrust investigation. They started investigating other things that are going on by U.S. companies in China.
Optical fiber anti-dumping.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was a market analyst, and I would look into real depth into certain markets. And there were some things like undersea cables, for example. It was like kind of still foreign dominated. So you can imagine how they feel as though, that maybe there are plenty of areas in which domestic competitors are still not as competitive. So you can imagine that if some market, like high-end white, high lumen LEDs or something, I was just making I wrote an article about that like 10 years ago. I don't know if that's still the case. You can imagine that they could argue that there's some dumping going on or whatever. Okay. And then we also talked earlier about the import suspensions. So these are the import controls. Now, again, what's already on here is Google and pretty much the entire US tech sector, but they also added just like logs, soybeans, some other things. And then they also list out the tariffs. But again, we know about those. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about were these barriers. So again, looking at my little map here, we have the US advance, with hitting them with the tariffs. We got the counterattack, but we see that the U.S. advance is being blocked by these three big white walls, calling barriers. Let's double click into what that is. First is the bond market. I think from our last episode, we saw the power of the bond market, I think, in action. It had it on Trump to slow him down. I think it's a major obstacle. If you want to look at it in depth, go watch that episode. The other thing is elections, or just time, right? I think time is on the Chinese side. So consumer confidence is falling, which we've also covered on this program. Trump's approval rating, I heard most recently, is starting to fall. The Chinese can just wait. And, they're not subject to the same domestic pressures as the US is. And the idea that something has to be done before the midterms so that those elected can remain in power, like that concept is wild, I think, to the Chinese. It's just you need to explain to them slowly and deliberately to like a set of confused faces. It's just not, they don't get it. So they'll use it to their advantage. And I think that's what happened partly in phase one, the phase one deal. Like the fact that it ended in 2020, I don't think is a coincidence. And it's an election year. The Chinese can drag their feet. And then the last barrier, the third one, is just sheer intelligence. And what I mean by that is, I think there's a lot more insight into what the U.S. does and how they might react, and not so much vice versa. The veil secrecy is very thick. Trump issued this fact sheet, right? Ensures national security and economic resilience through section blah 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 on processed critical minerals and derivative products. Like, what happened? I mean, this was April 15th. So what happened? A couple days or a week ago before that, they slapped some of those export controls on the rare earths. And the fact that this right here is made public, the fact that, damn, we got to go find some other source of this stuff, and that it was written on something like this, I think shows the Chinese that blood was drawn, right? Like that hurt. And they know it. But there's no corresponding set of intelligence or evidence that any action that we take can have like an effect like that. I mean, when the Chinese can see that the US is issuing an executive order to investigate other sources of rare earths, then the Chinese know that something they've done works. There is no analogous EO that are somehow public by the Chinese. Not really, for something like this. So again, advantage China.
So you're saying that's a function of the way in which politicians communicate, though?
No, I think it's more of a function of our system.
Which, like, I guess technically, like how they communicate is a function of the differences in the two systems.
Yeah,
right?
good point. It reminded me of like when I ask my son like, oh, do you want a little one? He's like, no, I want a small one. Like, okay.
I wasn't trying to do that, but
No, that's a good point. Yeah, you're right. Sure, it's how they communicate.
that's not to say that the Chinese don't communicate. Like I don't have any great examples, but I think whenever they do something like that, it's less direct.
I guess what I'm saying, yeah, right. You got to kind of read between the tea leaves. I guess what I'm saying is there an obvious tell that some negotiating tactic was very effective? I think this is a big tell. This felt like a scramble. I don't know.
I think, maybe a counterpoint is Weibo, like it was like a leak. It was like one of the informal voices of the government. It's like it is, but it isn't. And it was them coming out and saying, oh, the US has reached out to us, when before China was denying any kind of communications. And now this week there is some sort of communications. So to me, that was like, after seeing that, I'm expecting some more concrete action now, because I think it's clear, like you're saying, like the U.S. is starting to feel a little bit of pain here. Trump's approval is going down. That exact fact sheet that you just showed, maybe China felt that, okay, they've got some weakness to show now. This is not good for either of us. We can start to give a little bit now. That's just pure spec. Well, I mean, I think like what we were just talking about, you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit.
Maybe you're taking the more optimistic take. Mine has been somewhat pessimistic. I think that the U.S. has got a huge mountain to climb. I really wasn't sure how this might play out, but after I tried sort of putting things into a framework, this is what I landed on, and I got to say, it doesn't look good. I can see why change is incredibly hard. You've got major obstacles. You've got entrenched structural advantages that the Chinese have, as well as major kind of self-owns, if you'd like. You've got financial pressures from the bond market. You have political pressures from the election. And I think you have an intelligence disadvantage. So I think this is going to go the same route roughly as phase one. I think Trump came out swinging harder this time. I think he's going to have a good go at it. I think he should be commemorated in a way for that. But he also knows not to throw a lot of good resources. So soldiers, coin, blood, treasure against such kind of an entrenched position. We'll see what happens. I think balancing the trade, if the goal, like the end goal is to balance the trade deficit, I think that is unrealistic. I think there are too many structural barriers the Chinese have put in place that are firmly entrenched that would make that highly, highly unlikely. I think you might be able to eat away at some of these. I think these are on the negotiating table. I want that to happen. I mean, I would like, and I've said earlier on this program, how I think it would be great if there was balanced trade. I do. I want Trump to succeed in that goal. And if he does, I'll happily eat my words. So the other thing that he's trying to do is to bring more manufacturing jobs back. I think that will happen to a degree. Will it be sort of like a pivot into a new golden age? Also a little more skeptical, but what do you think?
I definitely don't think that's the pivot to a golden age. I mean, even like officials have been coming out and saying, like, look, we're not talking about we want to start making textiles again in the U.S., but we do want to have precision manufacturing. Like you think about like Tesla plants and the heavy use of robotics and just very high tech new cutting edge methods of manufacturing these things.
Yeah,
but
magic.
Yeah, pretty much
magic.
But also, just briefly, so you mentioned the bond market about the U.S. So yeah, we talked about that. seems very clear that that was, I think, probably the reason he was ultimately forced to back down. And, maybe even from some of the Powell comments as well, like we talked about last week. But it's also important to note that China is not in a great economic position either. And they haven't been since, I think, 2022. They've had consistent deflation for, I think, nearly 3 years now. And they've got the opposite problem in their bond markets. Their bond yields have fallen to, I think, maybe all-time lows even. So it was a similar. So people are very worried about the Japanification of China. That's kind of the real threat right now. So much of their economy. So like in the background, a lot of this is driven by sluggish activity. The opposite is if interest rates are going up, people are borrowing a lot of money. It's stimulating a lot of activity. But interest rates have been falling there for quite a while, and they've been battling deflation at the same time. If all of this excess output from exports that usually would go to the US, if that all drastically declines or, right now effectively goes to zero, how much more pain can they tolerate? Can they hold out longer than the US? From a political perspective, certainly. But if they fall into this kind of Japan growth trap, like the biggest risk to Chinese politics is that kind of, slowing economic growth, which would then lead to rising unemployment, which then would lead to social instability, presumably. So there's definitely, both sides really have a lot at stake right now. It's and just in general, like the U.S. is very obviously singled out China in this whole thing. They're being very aggressive. Obviously pause these tariffs on every other country to go and try to negotiate with them. Very obviously did not with China. So, to me, implicitly, they're trying to, turn the world against China.
Yeah. You're sort of talking to a bunch of stuff that I left on the editing floor, kind of when I was putting this together. And one thing I wanted to look into is what China wants. So I talked about what maybe the US wants, and then I also wanted to talk about what China wants. But then I also had a segment, again, that I didn't include in the original. Maybe I can get into the, we'll call this, the editing room floor, kind of the back of the episode if people are still watching. But I had a section on Chinese problems. And you mentioned deflation, and that is a big problem. And the cause of that, I'm sure, is multifaceted. The first thing you might think of is the way in which the Chinese have been able to grow as much as they have is really by investment. They just invest a lot. They just produce a whole lot. And that is the way to wealth. But it's one of these things where if you produce so much that it's going to have a deflationary impact on prices. There's just so much stuff.
Right. Without the consumption. That's the key thing.
Yeah, it's investment-based growth. And they've been trying, and in these 5-year plans, and yes, China still has 5-year plans, not as many, grain yield targets maybe as like the Soviet Union had 100 years ago, but they still have 5-year plans. And they've been talking about boosting consumption as like the driver of the economy for decades. And they just haven't really been able to do it. The other thing, the other real problem that so like when I watch the All In podcast, for, as I think a lot of our audience does too, when they kind of put these numbers forthright about how much electricity China wants to produce, yes, it is scary, and yes, I agree that the U.S. needs to absolutely get on top of it. But also in the back of my mind, there is the understanding that the Chinese, the way their economy works is by investing in stuff. They're just looking for everywhere to invest in stuff. And even if it's not going to be used, you can still invest in stuff. The over commoditization, that's a term that I used when I was writing stuff in China. It's just, you buy a whole bunch of production equipment and then you pump stuff out and then you make. And then when the government goes to build a new highway or something, all the lights that are going to be installed are going to be from domestic suppliers. And that's kind of how they boost up demand. But in a way, it's a big way of how they've done this thing. But just keep in the back of your mind that when growth targets are just through the roof, it's because they have nowhere else to put this money. That's what drives the economy. The other big problem is unequal growth. That's one of the big things that China is also struggling with. And there's a lot of dimensions they're looking at. The city growth compared to countrysides is hugely, the growth is very unequal. The east side of China and the west side of China, very unequal. And even the rich and the poor are very unequal. I think typically during this phase of a country's development, you should not expect to see the GINI index kind of rise as much as it has. But I can, and from like personal experience, when I was living there, I took my bike to work every morning, and I would go by some like really impoverished people, just living in concrete blocks, essentially. No running water, no electricity. I think they heated things with like these little coal tablets. And then you would ride your bike down the street a little farther, and you'd see a bunch of Ferraris and stuff. It's just like extremely stark. So if we wanted to end kind of on that note, China still has plenty of problems that they need to work through.
But since this trade war began, it does seem like China's hand has improved relative to the U.S. Yeah. And that's tough for me to say as an American, but I mean, I think that's just, but yeah, I mean, that's where we're at right now.
That's where we're at. Yeah. That's where I'm at right now. Maybe this will change. This is sort of my somber, trying to be honest with myself first. Try to look at things with our eyes open here, the Root of All Evil podcast. But,
yeah, man, that's all I have to sources, say. Objective views.
We're trying, and hopefully people in the comments will call us out if we go one way or the other, or we're not being objective. By all means, we invite it. The other thing that I had here was like some of the USA leverage, which we didn't really go into. We didn't go into any detail. It's like, what can the US do? That's kind of interesting. Maybe we'll save that for another episode, because I think we're going to be talking about this potentially on and off for the next couple of years, if I were to try to predict.
Easily.
So maybe we'll save that for another episode. If the U.S. decides to play hardball, but we'll see. All right, well, that's all I got. Thanks for tuning in to the Root of All Evil podcast. I'm Luke.
I'm Joe.
All right, see you next time.
See ya.